"Excuse me, ma'am, but your ticket is invalid. Can I see your passport?" the flight attendant said to Zara, the young black girl. Surprised and confused, Zara handed her the passport, thinking there was a misunderstanding somewhere. "Your passport doesn't look real also," the flight attendant said coldly. Zara blinked, still confused. She had traveled internationally before. There was nothing wrong with her passport. But before she could respond, the sound was sharp. Gasps filled the air as the flight attendant tore the passport in half, her expression unreadable. "Fake passports are a security risk," she muttered, tossing the torn pieces aside like garbage. Zara's heart pounded. Her breath hitched. That was her identity, her proof of who she was, now nothing but scraps in a stranger's hands. The terminal went silent. Eyes turned toward the scene. Some passengers whispered. Others pulled out their phones. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Passengers froze mid-step. Conversations died. The tapping of keyboards at the check-in desk halted. Even the distant hum of a nearby coffee machine seemed to fade into silence. A woman clasped a hand over her mouth in shock. A man in line spoke up. "I saw her passport. It looked real." The tension thickened. As we continue this story, if you are strongly against injustice and prejudice, click on the subscribe button now, like this video, and type in the comments where you're watching from. The airport was alive with movement. The hum of conversations, the rolling of suitcases, the steady announcements over the intercom. Among the travelers was a black girl, Zara Johnson, just 21, excited to return home after a semester abroad. She clutched her passport tightly, stepping forward with confidence. The line moved, slow but steady. Then it was her turn. Zara was a confident, smart, and ambitious young black woman, traveling alone to an important business meeting that could change the trajectory of her career. The flight was supposed to be a simple step in her day, a routine travel experience, nothing out of the ordinary. But Zara had learned the hard way that the ordinary was rarely as smooth as it seemed. Microaggressions had followed her everywhere. Small slights that might seem insignificant to others, but to Zara, they were constant reminders that she was never truly welcome. As she checked in at the counter, the high-end service of the airline should have been a relief. A place where she could escape from the petty judgments of everyday life. But even here, Zara couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The atmosphere at the airport was efficient, but cold. Everyone was going about their business, focused on their own agendas, indifferent to those around them. Zara glanced around at the polished marble floors, the sleek uniforms, and the luxury that oozed from the high-end airline. It all seemed so far removed from the world she had come from, and for a moment it made her feel even more out of place. She had been in similar settings before, places where the smiles were thin and the service just a little too perfect, as if everyone was performing an act. Zara was used to this feeling, but today it seemed more pronounced. Her unease was only magnified when she spotted Tiffany at the counter, a flight attendant in her late 20s who had that look of someone who knew exactly where they stood in the world. Tiffany was tall, her uniform perfectly pressed, her hair pulled back in a sharp, professional bun. She moved with an air of authority, but there was something about her that rubbed Zara the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she addressed the passengers with a hint of superiority, or the way she dismissed people without even thinking twice. But when Tiffany looked at Zara, there was a shift in her expression. Something that went beyond the usual customer service interaction. Tiffany's eyes lingered on Zara for just a moment longer than necessary. It was a look of judgment, the kind that Zara had become all too familiar with. The subtle recognition that Zara didn't belong here, that she wasn't the type to be traveling first class. Maybe it was her age, her appearance, or her race. Zara couldn't be sure. But one thing was certain. Tiffany was already making assumptions about her. And it didn't stop there. When Zara handed over her first-class ticket and waited for the usual smooth check-in, Tiffany's demeanor shifted completely. Her smile was thin, her tone was sharp. "I'm sorry, but your ticket is not in the system," Tiffany said, her eyes never leaving Zara's face. Zara blinked, momentarily taken aback. She looked at Tiffany, her voice calm but firm. "I believe there's been a mistake. My ticket should be valid. I just checked in online." Tiffany, however, didn't seem interested in hearing an explanation. Instead, she gestured for Zara to step aside. "Maybe if you knew how to properly book a flight and hold a real passport, you wouldn't be causing so many problems," Tiffany said, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. There was no kindness in her voice, no attempt at empathy, just cold, dismissive authority. And then the rip of her passport happened. Zara felt her legs wobble. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred at the edges, not from tears, but from sheer disbelief. "That was my real passport," she finally choked out, her voice breaking. The flight attendant, Tiffany, stood before her with a smug smile, barely meeting Zara's gaze. Zara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. It wasn't just the ticket. It was Zara herself. She could feel the judgment radiating from Tiffany, could see the way the flight attendant's eyes raked over her, dismissing her before she even had a chance to speak. Tiffany wasn't looking at Zara the way a customer service representative should look at a paying passenger. No, Tiffany was looking at her like she was a problem, a nuisance. It was all too familiar. The feeling of being out of place, of not fitting the mold that others expected her to fit. Zara looked around, but no one said anything. They looked too stunned to speak and were only recording what was happening. She knew she would soon trend for the wrong headline of traveling with a fake passport. Zara's chest tightened. She couldn't believe it. She had worked hard for everything she had, her education, her career, her achievements. And yet, here she was, being reduced to nothing more than a nuisance. She looked at Tiffany, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, fighting the urge to react with anger. But Zara was no stranger to this kind of treatment. She had dealt with it before. Still, the disrespect stung, and Zara's mind raced with thoughts of how she could handle the situation. She wanted to speak out, to confront Tiffany, but she knew better. She'd been in enough situations like this to know that reacting in anger only made things worse. Instead, Zara took a deep breath, her voice steady. "I'll resolve this with management," she said, trying to keep her composure. Tiffany barely acknowledged her response. Without another word, she turned away and gestured for Zara to step out of the line, as if Zara were the problem, not the one who had just been unjustly accused and her rights taken away. Have you ever experienced a situation where you were treated unfairly just because of your background? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to hit the subscribe button for more powerful stories like this. Zara stepped aside, her mind racing. She was angry, frustrated, but she didn't let it show on her face. Her father was the CEO of this airline, and she had half a mind to call him right there, to bring his power into the situation. But she didn't want to use him as a crutch. Not this time. Zara wanted to handle this on her own. She had worked so hard to build her own identity, and she wasn't about to let someone like Tiffany undermine that. Zara nodded, though the frustration was still bubbling inside her. She wasn't angry at her father. She was angry at the system, at people like Tiffany, who thought they could get away with this kind of behavior. It was time for her to take a stand, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel lesser. Zara stood up, wiped the frustration from her face, and walked back toward the gate, ready to face whatever came next. This wasn't just about a ticket or her passport. This was about respect. Zara walked away from the gate, the tension in her chest building with every step. She had kept her composure just like she always did, but inside, Her mind was spiraling. She had been here before, standing in these situations where everything around her seemed to subtly mock her existence. The looks, the judgment, the unfair treatment, Zara had faced them all. She paused, finding a quiet place near a row of empty chairs. She needed to breathe. This wasn't just a flight. This wasn't just a rude flight attendant. This was about a system that had been in place for far too long, one that made her feel like she had to constantly prove herself, one that made her feel invisible despite all her hard work and accomplishments. Zara took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, something felt different. Today, she couldn't just let it slide. Today, she would have to speak up. Her father's role in the airline industry flashed in her mind, and for the first time, she realized that she was standing at a crossroads. Zara's father was the CEO of this very airline, one of the most powerful figures in the company. He had been a champion of diversity and inclusion, using his position to push for change. But Zara had always kept that part of her life separate. She had never wanted to be seen as someone who used her family's position to get ahead. She worked hard to build her own reputation, to stand on her own. But in this moment, as her heart raced and her hands clenched into fists, Zara realized that sometimes it was okay to lean on the support you had. She didn't need to face this battle alone. So she quietly pulled out her phone and dialed her father's number. The phone rang twice before her father's calm, reassuring voice came through the speaker. "Zara, what's going on?" Zara took a deep breath, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Dad, something happened at the gate. A flight attendant, Tiffany, she tore up my passport and said my ticket was invalid. She told me I didn't belong in first class, and honestly, I'm tired of this. She committed a crime and I want her to pay dearly for it." Her father paused, and Zara could hear the steady sound of his breathing on the other end of the line. He was a man who had weathered his own storms in the corporate world, who had fought for equality and fairness in an industry that didn't always value it. He knew exactly what she was feeling. "What?" he shouted loudly on the phone. "Stay where you are. I'll take care of it. She will regret it." Zara nodded to herself, though her father couldn't see it. He always knew how to handle things, but Zara didn't want to rely on his influence. She wanted to take action herself. She didn't want to just be the daughter of the CEO. She wanted to be Zara, the one who demanded respect, the one who wouldn't tolerate being disrespected, no matter who she was. Meanwhile, Tiffany was on cloud nine. She had just dealt with Zara, and in her mind, she had done the world a favor. The audacity to come with an invalid ticket. Some people just need to be taught their place. Tiffany thought smugly as she moved through the boarding process with an air of superiority. She couldn't believe how easy it was to dismiss someone like Zara, someone who clearly didn't belong in first class. To Tiffany, Zara was just another riffraff, someone who had somehow managed to book a first-class ticket, but didn't deserve to be there. It wasn't personal, really. Tiffany just couldn't stand the thought of people like Zara infiltrating spaces they weren't meant to be in. She spoke with a few of her fellow crew members, laughing about the situation. "You should have seen her face when I told her the ticket was invalid, and when I tore her passport. She was trying to argue with me, but I wasn't having it. She needed to be put in her place." Tiffany couldn't help but feel a rush of pride as she thought about the way she had handled Zara. She felt like she had exercised her power, that she had been in control of the situation. After all, she was the flight attendant, the one in charge of the boarding process. People like Zara, people who didn't belong in her world, needed to be put in their place, and Tiffany was more than happy to do just that. As she moved toward the galley to prepare for the flight, Tiffany's confidence grew. She believed she had won, that Zara would slink off quietly without making a fuss. What she didn't realize, though, was that Zara wasn't just anyone. Zara was about to turn the tables in a way that Tiffany would never see coming. What would you do in a situation like this? Have you ever been treated unfairly and had to fight for your dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Zara sat still, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for her father's call. She knew the wheels were already in motion behind the scenes. But Zara wasn't just going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let Tiffany get away with the abuse of power. Zara knew she couldn't let this go. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. She didn't want to take things to an extreme, but she was no longer willing to stand by and let this type of behavior go unnoticed. She was going to make sure that Tiffany and the airline understood the consequences of treating people like this. Zara took a moment to calm herself, to focus on the task at hand. She didn't want to make a scene, but she needed to make sure Tiffany faced consequences for her actions. Zara quietly called the airline's higher-ups, making sure to keep the conversation discreet. "I don't want to escalate this, but she committed a crime and has to pay for it," Zara said calmly. Zara could hear the concern in the voice of the higher-up she spoke to, and it gave her a sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this. Zara wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in power. She stayed where she was, watching Tiffany from a distance. Tiffany was completely oblivious to what was happening behind the scenes, her smug confidence still on full display as she went about her duties. Zara's heart pounded, knowing that the moment of confrontation was coming, but she wasn't afraid. She had a plan, and she wasn't backing down. Zara had already made her decision. This was going to be handled with grace, with dignity, and most importantly, with the strength of conviction. She wasn't just the daughter of the CEO anymore. She was Zara, the woman who refused to let anyone disrespect her, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The stage was set. Tiffany had no idea what was coming. Zara hadn't always been the type to stand up for what was right, but it wasn't until she learned about her friend Brandon's experiences at the airport that something inside her finally clicked. Brandon, the young man Zara had known for years, had always been the picture of calm. He had been through his own struggles with discrimination, but his quiet strength had always inspired Zara. He was the kind of person who carried himself with dignity, no matter the circumstances. But there was one experience that changed everything for Brandon. One that Zara had never known about until he opened up, and that sparked something in her. It all started when Brandon was flying for a business trip to a city across the country. Zara and Brandon were close friends, often confiding in each other, supporting each other through the ups and downs of life. But Brandon had always kept something from Zara. Something that, in his mind, he didn't want to burden her with. Every time Brandon flew, he always flew with the best airline in the country, but the airline was deeply rooted in prejudice. No matter the destination, he was treated the same way. At first, it had started as subtle questioning, a few looks that made him uncomfortable, but soon escalated. Every time he would approach security, he would be singled out. He was always pulled aside for a random check, something he knew wasn't really random at all. Brandon, with his darker skin, was often the target of suspicion. He was subjected to intense questioning. It wasn't just once or twice. It happened every single time he boarded a flight with that airline. He'd come to expect it, though it never made it easier. Brandon was used to the indignity, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. The constant surveillance, the way his every move was scrutinized, it wore him down. He was treated like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong, despite having the same rights and the same responsibilities as any other person on the plane. One fateful day, the situation reached its peak. On his way to an important meeting, he was pulled aside once again, forced to wait in the search room while everyone else breezed through. His confidence shattered as he was subjected to a humiliating search. This time, however, something inside him broke. He couldn't do it anymore. The constant harassment had worn him thin, and as the search continued, he couldn't hold back the tears. What made it worse was that no one said anything. No one came to his defense. The staffs went about their work, and the other passengers carried on, pretending they didn't see. When he finally made it to his gate, he was exhausted, emotionally drained. But his feelings of hopelessness were replaced by a quiet, simmering anger. He was tired of being treated this way, tired of being defined by someone else's biases. He didn't speak about the incident to anyone, but it weighed heavily on him. He finally stopped flying with that airline and started flying with another. This other airline treated him so well like a king throughout his trip that he forgot his old experiences and knew that not all airlines were bad. When Zara found out about what had happened to Brandon, she was shocked. Brandon had never once mentioned the repeated harassment. He had always been the kind of person who brushed off these kinds of things, always trying to keep his head high and maintain his dignity. But after experiencing the good deeds of the other airline he boarded, he decided to speak out. He described the experience in raw, painful detail. Zara listened in disbelief. She had always known about prejudice and the struggles people like Brandon faced. But hearing it firsthand, hearing the hurt and anger in his voice, was something that shook her to her core. Zara had never been in Brandon's shoes. She'd never been subjected to the kind of treatment he had endured. But hearing his story ignited a fire inside her. It was no longer just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for every person who had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. Zara began to reflect on her own experiences at the airport, the disrespect she had encountered from Tiffany. She realized that Brandon's story was her story too. Zara's decision to stand up to Tiffany wasn't just a reaction to her own experience. It was a response to the experiences of everyone who had been harassed, discriminated against, and made to feel less than. It was a moment of clarity for her. A moment where she understood that she couldn't just sit by and let people like Tiffany get away with their prejudiced actions. Brandon's story had fueled her. It had given her the motivation to speak up, not just for herself, but for all the invisible people who suffered quietly, whose stories were often ignored. The tension in the air was high as the final calls for boarding echoed through the terminal. Zara stood at the gate, trying to steady her breathing, her mind swirling with everything that had just transpired. The last few minutes had felt like an eternity, and though her father had assured her that he would take care of it, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. This wasn't just about her passport anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and standing up for what was right. As she stood there, glancing toward the boarding gate, she noticed movement from across the terminal. It was him. Her father, the CEO of the airline, walked into the terminal, his presence immediately commanding attention. Flanked by his team of executives, Zara's father exuded the calm authority that had made him one of the most influential figures in the industry. His tailored suit, the confident stride, the way his eyes scanned the room, he was every inch the man in charge. The staff at the gate immediately recognized him. There was a shift in the air as the crew members who had been moving with purpose froze for a moment. They exchanged glances, whispers passing between them, all of them aware that the CEO had just entered their space. Zara watched from the corner of her eye. She knew her father would be here soon, but she hadn't expected him to be here so quickly. He had always been the person who handled things behind the scenes, out of sight. But today it seemed like everything was happening in front of her eyes. Meanwhile, Tiffany, completely unaware of who was standing in the background, continued with her duties. She was still riding the high of her earlier victory, feeling confident in her decision to send Zara away. Tiffany didn't realize the gravity of what she had just done, how her actions had escalated things beyond her control. To Tiffany, everything was still business as usual. She made her rounds, smiling at passengers, checking boarding passes, her expression untroubled, as if the chaos she had started had already been forgotten. Tiffany, feeling secure in her position, walked towards Zara once again, the same smug expression on her face. She was about to deliver the news that would seal Zara's fate, telling her that she would need to get another passport, effectively dismissing her from the boarding process. She took a step closer to Zara, her tone still condescending. "I'm sorry, but it looks like you'll have to get another ticket with a real passport. We can't let you board with that one," she said, her voice carrying an air of finality, believing that she was in control. But this time, there was something different in the air. Zara stood up straighter. Her posture was calm, but there was an undeniable sense of resolve behind her movements. Before Tiffany could finish her sentence, Zara's voice interrupted her, calm and composed. "You know," she said slowly, "you might want to double-check that passport you tore. My father is the CEO of this airline, and you and I know the passport you tore was real." Tiffany paused for a split second, the words sinking in. She glanced over her shoulder, finally noticing the familiar figure standing just behind Zara. Her eyes widened in recognition. The CEO, her face paled. This wasn't just any random passenger. This was Zara's father, the man she had just disrespected without a second thought. Tiffany's smug expression quickly faded as her face shifted into something resembling panic. She stammered, trying to recover from her mistake, but the damage had already been done. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't realize." Zara's father stepped forward, his presence now undeniable. His calm demeanor was the exact opposite of Tiffany's flustered reaction. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that made everyone around them stop in their tracks. Zara's father addressed Tiffany directly, his tone firm but not raised. "Tiffany," he said, his voice cutting through the air, "I've been in this industry long enough to know when someone is abusing their power. And what you just did was not only unprofessional, it was completely unacceptable." Tiffany's face flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to apologize, but her words were lost in the moment, the magnitude of her mistake sinking in. She had just tried to deny the daughter of the CEO access to her rightful seat and tore her passport. Tiffany, who had felt so secure in her actions moments ago, was now visibly shaken. She stammered, her words coming out in an almost incoherent jumble. I'm sorry, I didn't mean any harm. I just thought, I didn't know. I'm sorry," Tiffany blurted, but her apologies felt hollow, insincere. Zara's father shook his head, his expression unwavering. "It's not about an apology anymore, Tiffany. It's about accountability. What you did was disrespectful and a crime, and it was wrong. You don't get to treat people like that, especially not on my airline." Zara's passport pieces was assembled together and checked to verify the authenticity before everyone, and it was proved to be real beyond reasonable doubt. At this point, security officers were around to arrest Tiffany. Should Tiffany be arrested or forgiven? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the story. The silence in the terminal was deafening. Everyone around them had stopped what they were doing, watching the exchange unfold. Zara's father wasn't just reprimanding Tiffany. He was setting an example. It was clear to everyone around them that this behavior would not be tolerated. Tiffany was learning a painful lesson, and Zara could feel a rush of empowerment flowing through her. She wasn't the victim anymore. She had the power to make this right. With her father's support behind her, Zara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "I expect this to be handled properly," she said, looking directly at Tiffany. "You need to be held accountable for your actions. This kind of behavior is never acceptable, and I won't let it slide." Zara wasn't angry. No, this was different. This was the moment where she reclaimed her power. She had spent so long letting others dismiss her, but not today. Not anymore. Zara's father nodded in agreement, his voice steady. "I'll make sure this is reported to higher management. Tiffany, I don't need to explain why your actions were wrong. You're an adult, and you should know better. But we'll handle it through the proper channels." Tiffany, still flustered, nodded, but there was a palpable tension in the air. She knew this wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a turning point. Zara's father turned to Zara, his expression softening just slightly. "Zara, you don't have to get involved further if you don't want to. I'll handle it from here. But rest assured, Tiffany's actions will be addressed." Zara felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had taken control of the situation. This wasn't about revenge, this was about justice. As Zara and her father walked away, heading toward their seats on the plane, a deep sense of relief washed over Zara. This moment had been transformative. She had gone from being the quiet, patient girl who always let things slide to the girl who took a stand, who demanded respect when it was due. And now, a new passport was being processed to be delivered to her soon. Zara knew she wouldn't always have the backing of her father. But in this moment, she realized that the power she had always carried within herself was enough. She didn't need to rely on anyone else to validate her worth. She had the strength to speak up, to fight for what was right, and to demand the dignity she deserved. And that was a victory that no one could ever take away from her. After the confrontation at the gate, Zara's mind was racing, but the situation wasn't over. The wheels were already in motion. Tiffany's actions had caught the attention of Zara's father, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. Tiffany had no idea what she was in for. She had thought that her actions, so carelessly executed, would go unnoticed. But Zara's father, the CEO of the airline, was not a man who would tolerate such behavior. Behind closed doors, in the airline's main office, an investigation was underway. Tiffany was now under scrutiny for racial misconduct. What had started as a minor confrontation at the gate was quickly snowballing into something far larger. The very company Tiffany had worked for was now assessing the severity of her actions. A former employee of the airline, a black woman named Camille, who had worked under Tiffany's supervision years ago, reached out to Zara's father with a disturbing revelation. Camille had once been a promising flight attendant, dedicated to her job and passionate about making air travel a welcoming experience for all. But her career had been cut short because of Tiffany. Camille explained that years ago, she had been targeted and harassed by Tiffany in ways eerily similar to what Zara had experienced. At first, it was subtle. Tiffany would assign Camille the most grueling tasks, belittle her in front of colleagues, and constantly imply that she wasn't professional enough for the job. Then, it escalated. Camille recalled an incident where Tiffany falsely reported her for being rude to a passenger, an accusation that had no evidence but was taken seriously by upper management at the time. The constant harassment pushed Camille into a corner, and despite her best efforts to prove herself, she was eventually pressured into resigning. She had felt powerless, abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect her. Hearing about Zara's experience had brought back all of Camille's buried pain. But this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. She had evidence Zara's father listened carefully to Camille's account, and then she sent over something that changed everything. An old recording, a recording that Camille had secretly taken during one of her last days working under Tiffany. In the audio, Tiffany could be heard openly mocking Camille, saying things like, "I don't know why you're still here. This job isn't for people like you." Then another voice, Tiffany's voice again, laughing with another flight attendant, saying, "You know they only hired her because they need diversity. But trust me, she won't last long. People like her never do." It was damning evidence. When Zara's father played the recording for his executive team, the room fell into a stunned silence. There was no way Tiffany could talk her way out of this. She had been targeting people for years, abusing her power, destroying careers, and getting away with it. And now, all of it was coming to light. Just as the investigation into Tiffany's misconduct was concluding, Zara and her father decided to confront Tiffany one last time. This time, Tiffany wasn't the one in control. This time, the power belonged to those she had tried to silence. When Tiffany was called into a meeting with the airline's leadership, her usual smug confidence was gone. She could sense that something had shifted, that this wasn't just about a single incident anymore. She walked in, expecting another warning, maybe a suspension at worst. But when Zara's father played the recording, that undeniable proof of her years of discrimination, Tiffany's face turned pale. She immediately tried to defend herself, scrambling for excuses. "That was taken out of context. I was joking. You can't prove anything." But the evidence was too overwhelming. Her pattern of targeting black passengers, mistreating employees, and creating a toxic environment within the airline was undeniable. Tiffany's reign of silent discrimination had finally come to an end. With no other option, the airline's board made the decision to terminate Tiffany immediately, banning her from working for any airline under their corporate umbrella. Next, she was arrested, and all charges counted against her. This wasn't just a personal victory for Zara. It was a victory for everyone Tiffany had ever hurt. A victory for Camille. A victory for all the passengers and employees who had suffered under her abuse of power. But the impact didn't stop there. When news of Tiffany's firing hit the media, it quickly went viral. People across the country started sharing their own experiences of discrimination in the airline industry. Passengers who had been harassed, employees who had been treated unfairly, and countless others who had suffered in silence for far too long. Zara's bravery had become a catalyst for change. Other airlines took notice, and suddenly, conversations about systemic bias in air travel were happening at a national level. More companies announced plans to overhaul their diversity training, enforce stricter policies against discrimination, and listen to the voices of those who had been ignored for so long. And Zara? She watched it all unfold, knowing that she had done something truly meaningful. She had taken a stand not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Zara's father was known for his commitment to fairness and justice, not just in the policies he implemented, but also in the way he handled conflicts within his company. This wasn't just about punishing an employee. It was about setting an example, about making it clear that racism would not be tolerated, not in any form, at any level of the organization. It was clear to Zara that this wasn't just about Tiffany. This was about changing the culture of an entire industry. The conversation wasn't just about her. It was about making the airline a better, more inclusive place for everyone. In response to the situation, Zara's father made a bold move. Rather than letting the incident fade away, he used it as an opportunity to bring about meaningful change. He called for a company-wide overhaul of the diversity training programs and stressed the importance of creating an environment where every employee, regardless of their background, could feel valued. It was clear that the way things had been done before wasn't enough. The airline needed to do more, not just for their employees, but for the passengers who trusted them to provide an inclusive, respectful service. Meanwhile, news of the incident began to spread. What had seemed like a simple exchange between a flight attendant and a passenger was now capturing the attention of the public. Zara's quiet determination in the face of injustice resonated with so many people. Across social media, people were rallying behind her, applauding her courage in standing up for herself when so many others might have stayed silent. The incident sparked a much-needed conversation about racial bias in service industries, a conversation that had long been swept under the rug but was finally coming into the light. Zara's father's swift action didn't go unnoticed either. People were impressed by his response, the way he took the issue seriously and worked to address it head-on. It wasn't just about disciplining Tiffany. It was about recognizing the larger systemic issues at play and taking active steps to address them. And Zara? Well, her actions spoke louder than words ever could. She wasn't looking for attention. She wasn't trying to be a hero. But her decision to speak out against an injustice, to call out what had been done to her, had inspired countless others who had experienced similar discrimination. The feedback was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in, with people from all walks of life sharing their own experiences and expressing gratitude for Zara's courage. In the wake of the incident, Zara's story became a beacon for others. Her story wasn't just about an unfair moment at an airport. It was about standing up to a system that had too often let people like her be treated as second class. It was about the power of using your voice when others are too afraid to speak. Zara had become a symbol of resilience, strength, and courage for those who had been silenced for far too long. As the public conversation continued, Zara found herself in the middle of a storm that she had never intended to create. But as she watched the support grow, she realized that this moment had the potential to be a turning point, not just for her, but for others who had been marginalized. Zara wasn't someone who craved attention, but she could see the impact of her actions, and she realized that this was an opportunity to make a difference. Her involvement in this situation had sparked a movement that was bigger than her. As the airline made their internal changes and Tiffany's case was handled, Zara's role in the larger conversation became more clear. Her voice had mattered. Her decision to speak up had created real change. Zara hadn't just reclaimed her dignity in that moment at the gate. She had become an advocate for fairness, equality, and respect. It wasn't lost on her that her story was being shared far and wide, not just within the airline, but across industries. People in other sectors began speaking up about their own experiences with discrimination, drawing inspiration from Zara's actions. This moment, which had begun as an isolated incident, was becoming part of a larger, global conversation about how to fight systemic racism in public spaces, businesses, and institutions. Zara stood in the airport, the hum of the terminal around her fading into the background as her thoughts focused on the events that had transpired. She had done something that was both incredibly simple and incredibly difficult. She had stood up for herself. But in doing so, she had done so much more. She had created a ripple effect that would reach far beyond the gates of that airport. As her father's company made internal changes to address racial misconduct and promote inclusion, Zara's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't just about the airline anymore. It was about creating a space where no one would ever have to face the same kind of treatment again. The changes they were making would not only improve the airline, but would hopefully inspire other businesses to follow suit. Zara's actions had set a precedent, and now, more than ever, she understood the power of speaking up. Her decision had made a difference. It had given others the courage to do the same. Zara had reclaimed her power. She had made her voice heard, not through anger or frustration, but through calm, measured action. And in doing so, she had sparked a larger conversation, one that would continue long after the story had faded from the headlines. Zara's quiet determination had turned into a movement, one that would shape the future of corporate culture and service industries for years to come. And as the story of what had happened at that gate continued to ripple through the world, Zara knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just a passenger on a flight. She was a force for change, and nothing could stop her now. Zara's actions had sparked change within her father's company, but they had also sparked a transformation in herself. She wasn't just standing up for what was right in one moment. She was standing up for herself, her worth, and the dignity of everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It wasn't just about confrontation. Zara understood now that standing up for herself wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of empowerment. She had reclaimed the power that had always been there but had been suppressed for so long. And now, she was using her voice not just to demand respect, but to create a legacy of respect and accountability. In the months that followed, Zara continued her journey, not hiding behind her father's name, but embracing her own. She stepped forward into leadership roles, advocating for diversity and inclusion, not just within her father's company, but in every space she entered. Her voice became stronger with each conversation, and with each conversation, she built a foundation of change. With Brandon's pain and his strength in her heart, Zara found the courage to face her own struggles head-on. The confrontation with Tiffany had been the start of something much larger. A movement not just for Zara, but for all the people who had been silent for too long. She now understood that standing up for herself wasn't just about defending her dignity. It was about standing up for every person who had been wronged. She began to speak out more, not only about her own experiences, but about the invisible battles that people like Brandon fought every single day. The realization that her actions had inspired change within her father's company and beyond was both humbling and empowering. Zara wasn't just part of a larger conversation. She was leading it. Zara no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need to justify her place in the world. She had already earned it. And as she stood in front of crowds, addressing audiences about the importance of fairness and respect, Zara realized that the fight was bigger than herself. It was about creating a future where people didn't have to fight for their worth, where respect was given freely, without question, without prejudice. Her journey had just begun. Did you enjoy this story? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more inspiring stories like this. See you in the next one.